December 1961. A 36-year-old man lies hidden in a Maryland hospital bed. He is traveling under a false identity because returning openly to French control could mean arrest. His wife, Josie, sits beside him, reading the first reviews of a book he just finished. 3 days later, his life ends. Soon after its release, French authorities moved to ban the book and seize copies where they could from bookstores. Why, exactly, would an empire fear a gravely ill patient? Because the diagnosis he left behind was not medical, it was political, and it named the damage empire inflicted on the human mind. His name was Frantz Fanon. The roots of that diagnosis did not begin in a hospital or on a battlefield. It began inside a quiet Caribbean classroom, in a town that had mastered the art of erasing a people's past. On the 20th of July, 1925, Frantz Omar Fanon was born in Fort-de-France, Martinique. His family stood inside a Martinican middle class shaped by colonial assimilation. His father worked as a diligent customs inspector. His mother carried white ancestry, a trait treated locally as a quiet treasure. They were cautious, deeply proud, and determined to be more French than the French. The society he entered was an engineered hierarchy, precisely calculated down to the shade of a person's skin. At the top sat roughly 2,000 Békés, the white planter descendant elite holding immense wealth. Beneath them, a mixed ancestry Creole elite managed the paperwork. At the bottom, the descendants of enslaved Africans provided the labor. But the empire did not maintain control through force alone. It colonized the mind. The French Republic built more than schools. It built classrooms that taught black children how to see themselves through French eyes. The first history lesson they absorbed was about their supposed ancestors, the Gauls. A Martinican child learned to write the phrase, "I am French," before learning a single fact about their own origins. The erasure reached into language, history, school books, and public memory. They were molded into willing subjects who wore black skin, but learned to see the reality around them through the eyes of France. The ultimate proof of this cultural conditioning stood permanently in the public square. A heavy bronze statue of Victor Schulzer, a white French politician, towered over the park. Below him knelt a freed black man, staring up at his liberator in a pose of frozen, permanent gratitude. During a school trip, a 10-year-old Fanon stood before this monument. While his classmates absorbed the intended lesson of lifelong subservience, his mind rebelled. He asked a dangerous question. He demanded to know what existed before the chains, before the brutal sugar plantations, before the mandatory gratitude. No teacher possessed an answer they dared speak aloud. The boy realized the colonial structure functioned on an enforced denial. The empire demanded its subjects be endlessly grateful for the removal of the exact same shackles the empire itself had forged. True power was not merely owning a person's labor, it was making them proud of their own subjugation. To Fanon, this was not a healthy society. It was a system, training people to live inside a false memory. The deep psychological sickness he would later diagnose in his wartime patients was already festering right here, disguised as civilization and legal citizenship. The fragile illusion of that civilized cage shattered in the autumn of 1939. When the Republic across the ocean fell to advancing German forces, Martinique did not simply become a distant observer. The entire island was swiftly dragged under the direct military control of the collaborationist Vichy regime. Thousands of French sailors and military personnel arrived from warships, bringing Vichy authority directly onto the island. Their sudden presence rapidly choked the island. Severe hunger followed them ashore. Essential food supplies were diverted to feed the stationed military, leaving the local population to scrape by on cassava flour and whatever scraps remained. The sailors carried themselves with a bruising arrogance. They harassed local women openly on the streets. They treated the local population with undisguised contempt. The polite, carefully maintained fiction of French equality dissolved into raw, racial hostility. Rumors even spread through quiet homes that the military command might reinstate slavery itself. Inside the walls of the local high school, a different kind of resistance was taking shape. A new philosophy teacher named Aimé Césaire began gathering the older students. He possessed the exact vocabulary the young men needed to dissect their reality. Césaire and his wife, Suzanne, stripped away the comforting lies of colonial assimilation. They argued that the colonized population had been deeply contaminated by a forced belief in European superiority. The psychological damage was severe. The local people were mimicking their rulers so desperately they had forgotten their own identity. Other mentors offered a different, quieter survival strategy. A pacifist teacher advised the teenage Frantz to stay out of the escalating global conflict. The logic was coldly pragmatic. When European powers tear each other apart, the colonized should simply stand back and survive. It was simply a white man's war. Frantz rejected this argument. His internal moral compass operated on unyielding principles. He harbored a fierce belief in universal human dignity. In his mind, the men enforcing Vichy rule on his island were false citizens, tyrants operating in camouflage. He genuinely believed that wherever human freedom was threatened, regardless of geography or race, it was his personal responsibility to intervene. He was determined to fight for the very ideals the empire preached, but refused to practice. Action required risk. In January of 1943, during the distraction of a family wedding, the 18-year-old quietly slipped away from the celebration. He had secretly secured funds by selling stolen bolts of cloth on the black market to pay a local smuggler. Standing on a dark, unlit beach, he stepped into a fragile boat and pushed out into the treacherous ocean currents toward the neighboring island of Dominica. He was leaving his home behind to enlist in the Free French forces. He sailed into the center of a global war, armed with an unwavering conviction that he was joining a universal crusade against tyranny. He had no idea that the empire he was rushing to defend was preparing a betrayal far worse than enemy fire. He crossed an ocean to fight European fascism, only to discover that the republic he was defending operated on the same logic of racial supremacy. The Grand Brotherhood of Arms dissolved the moment he boarded the transport ship heading toward North Africa. Black volunteers were marched directly into the dark, unventilated holds, packed together like cargo, kept out of sight from the command. The transition from equal citizen to disposable subject was immediate. Upon arriving in the port city of Oran, the brutal arithmetic of the colonial empire fully revealed itself. The vast military apparatus was segregated by origin and race. Because of their origin, West Indian soldiers were classified as honorary Europeans and issued standard military caps. Meanwhile, African infantrymen were forced into separate units, visibly marked by their uniforms as a lower caste. The cruelty of this system became undeniable in the streets. He watched starving Arab children fighting desperately in the dirt over tiny discarded scraps of food, scraps that white French soldiers tossed down purely for their own cheap amusement. He realized that the empire operated as an unforgiving hierarchy, where human dignity was strictly rationed by skin color. This was not a noble brotherhood fighting against fascism. It was a chilling mirror image of it. Despite the profound humiliation, he fought fiercely. During the freezing winter of 1944, he sustained serious chest injuries under heavy mortar fire. He bled willingly for the Republic. He earned military commendations. Then came a policy known as blanchiment, the whitening of the army. As the Allied forces prepared for the triumphant, publicized liberation of Paris and the crossing of the Rhine, a sudden, irreversible order came down. Many black African troops, especially Senegalese soldiers, were removed from frontline formations in a process known as blanchiment, while West Indian soldiers like Fanon remained in an uneasy, racially marked position. The official military explanation claimed these men could not endure the winter cold. The undeniable reality was entirely about the cameras. The political leadership required the historical propaganda footage of the victory to feature exclusively white faces. The empire readily consumed the lives of its colonized subjects in the trenches, but erased their very existence from the official historical record. They were useful in the trenches, yet forbidden from participating in the victory they had secured. The universal crusade against tyranny was an orchestrated lie. The very nation demanding his sacrifice was terrified of his visibility. Surrounded by freezing mud in the Colmar pocket in April 1945, facing the immediate threat of his own death, the last remnants of his colonial conditioning vanished entirely. He drafted a devastatingly brief letter to his parents back in Martinique. He admitted he had made a catastrophic error. He questioned why he had ever left his home to defend an obsolete ideal. He delivered one final, bitter instruction. He told them plainly that if he did not survive the next morning, they must never tell anyone he died for a beautiful cause. Surviving the freezing, war-torn trenches of Europe altered his internal vision, making his eventual return to the Caribbean deeply unsettling. The coastal town of Fort-de-France remained exactly as he left it, but the petty arithmetic of color now felt unbearable. The lighter-skinned Creole bureaucrats maintained their careful ledgers, obsessively tracking whose grandmother had what specific shade of skin to determine social worth. He observed the so-called returnees, West Indians who had spent time in Europe, performing an artificial whiteness upon their arrival home. They adamantly refused to speak their native Creole. They dropped the names of prestigious Parisian neighborhoods into every casual conversation, demanding recognition from a system that despised them. After witnessing the raw violence of a global war, this local manufactured hierarchy of assimilation disgusted him. The triviality of their posturing was an insult to the memory of the dead he left behind. He resolved never to become one of them. He returned to the local classroom to finish his educational qualifications, crossing paths again with Joseph Heery. The former pacifist teacher handed him a chilling sentence he would carry for the rest of his life. Heery warned his students that whenever they heard someone violently insulting the Jews, they must pay strict attention, because the aggressor was actually talking about them. The lesson was sharp and permanent. The fascist hatreds tearing Europe apart, and the polite institutionalized colonial racism suffocating his island, were simply branches growing from the exact same tree. The core structure of oppression was identical, merely wearing different masks in different climates. The island had quickly grown far too small for the questions he could no longer ignore. A government scholarship designated specifically for demobilized war veterans provided his vital exit route from an island that felt increasingly like a cultural prison. He chose to study medicine, seeking a science that dealt with human wounds and raw anatomy, rather than polite fictions. In 1946, he boarded a ship for the long 12-day crossing back across the Atlantic Ocean. He initially arrived in Paris, but he rejected the bustling capital almost immediately. The sprawling city was packed with West Indian and African students, endlessly debating revolutionary politics in safe, isolated dormitories. It felt uncomfortably like Fort-de-France in miniature, a protected bubble separating them from the harsh reality of the mainland. He refused that comfortable cultural armor. He packed his bags and deliberately selected Lyon instead. It was a fiercely conservative, provincial city characterized by cold weather and virtually no black population whatsoever. He did not travel there seeking comfort or a familiar community. He went there to strip away every layer of cultural protection. He wanted to walk, exposed, into the center of the white gaze. He needed to test exactly what the Republic would do when forced to confront him face to face, stripped of any polite colonial illusions, war medals, or military uniforms. He was no longer the compliant soldier in the freezing mud. He was preparing to study something deeper, how empire damaged the mind. He had deliberately sought out the unfiltered gaze of the mainland, and the city of Lyon delivered it with brutal efficiency. The reckoning began almost immediately on the cold, gray streets. Walking home one evening, local police abruptly intercepted him. They questioned him sharply, mistaking him for an Algerian laborer from the Guillotière slums. Upon realizing he was a Martinican medical student, their hostility instantly dissolved into a warm, deeply insulting apology. They casually explained that they, obviously, knew a West Indian was different from an Arab. He walked away from that encounter carrying a cold realization about the system. The authorities had just explicitly demonstrated the precise hierarchy of colonial racism, where human value was strictly measured by varying degrees of subjugation. Inside the medical faculty, the isolation deepened. He was one of only a handful of black students in a massive lecture hall of 400. The prejudice was rarely shouted. It came wrapped in polite condescension. White professors routinely expressed exaggerated astonishment at his perfect command of the French language, treating his intellect as a bizarre anomaly. The discrimination soon became quantifiable. On a major examination where he undeniably earned a 9, a professor deliberately handed him a 5. The hollow consolation arrived months later, when that exact same instructor finally decided to address him with the respectful pronoun formal vous, instead of the familiar, dismissive informal tu. His peers were no better, throwing the nickname Whitey across the room to remind him of his place. The humiliation reached a breaking point inside the anatomy room. While leaning over a body, a professor casually pointed out that the skull was a racialized skull. He described through racist language. A classmate immediately shouted across the room, asking if Whitey had heard the observation. The room erupted into sudden laughter. Frantz did not argue. He picked up a surgical instrument and stepped forward, permanently shutting down the mockery. Nobody ever dared to test that boundary again. Outside the lecture halls, he conducted night medical visits deep inside the Algerian quarters. He entered dirty, isolated rooms where men described agonizing pains that no X-ray could possibly locate. The senior French doctors he worked alongside possessed a highly convenient clinical term for this suffering. They diagnosed it as the so-called North African syndrome, a dismissive medical code meant to imply malingering, inherent laziness, and chronic lying. The medical establishment refused to acknowledge the genuine trauma of the displaced and the colonized. He categorically rejected this lazy diagnosis. He observed these exhausted laborers and realized that their severe agony was real, but its root cause was not biological. General medicine possessed no tools to treat a sickness engineered by social alienation. The physical deterioration was merely a symptom of a much deeper, structural violence. The wound was psychological, created by a society that kept telling them they did not fully belong. He understood precisely what he needed to do. He abandoned general medicine to search for a real cure. To dismantle the damage the colonial world inflicted upon the human body, he had to master psychiatry. The decision to abandon general medicine left him holding an unorthodox psychiatric manuscript that the traditional academic faculty categorically rejected. The text was sprawling and furious, completely devoid of standard clinical detachment. Through progressive networks, the pages eventually landed on the desk of Francis Janson, a young editor in Paris who possessed a deep personal comprehension of rebellion. Janson immediately recognized the text's explosive value, noting that the truths within it had clearly burned the author's flesh. Together, they rigorously refined the pages. In April 1952, the manuscript was officially published under a title that redefined the psychology of subjugation: Black Skin, White Masks. The beating heart of this powerful work was not constructed from dry academic theory. It was anchored by a deeply traumatic personal rupture, occurring on a freezing train carriage. A white child pointed at him and cried out in fear, reducing the man in front of him to a racial fantasy before Fanon could speak a word. The mother desperately attempted to pacify the child by whispering nervous, awkward compliments about his appearance, layering a different kind of violence over the initial insult. In that specific, confined space, his reality collapsed. He described the white gaze acting as a chemical fixative. It froze him in place, locking his body into a predetermined, inescapable narrative of savagery, engineered by European fantasies. He was turned into an object. A whole false history was placed on his body before he could speak. Traditional psychoanalysis could explain the suffering of an individual. Fanon was looking at something larger, a wound produced by the whole colonial order. He required a much heavier, sharper tool. He coined the term sociogeny to carry this immense weight. He argued that the severe alienation and intense internalized oppression destroying the colonized mind did not originate from individual biological or psychological flaws. The surrounding social structure itself manufactured the mental illness. The book mercilessly dissected the desperate psychological need of the subjugated to achieve basic human validation by mimicking their oppressors. He diagnosed this agonizing pursuit of societal approval as a tragic attempt to permanently weld a white mask over dark skin. He declared that the fundamental cure for this condition could never be discovered on a quiet therapist's couch. If the colonial world engineered the disease, then the colonial order itself had to be broken and rebuilt. When the revolutionary text finally reached the public, the mainstream French press responded with a coordinated silence. Major national publications entirely ignored its very existence. One prominent conservative reviewer publicly sneered at the text, dismissively claiming the author was simply sick from his race in the exact same manner a patient suffers from the measles, arrogantly instructing the psychiatrist to heal his own mind. The establishment failed to comprehend the reality of the situation. He had successfully written the definitive medical record of a diseased civilization, laying the essential ideological groundwork for a wider global rupture that would soon follow. Armed with this diagnostic framework, he sought an environment to test his theories. In April of 1952, he traveled to the isolated Saint-Alban psychiatric hospital in southern France. The facility operated under the fierce direction of François Tosquel, an exiled Catalan doctor who previously treated wounded soldiers during the Spanish Civil War. Tosquel had effectively transformed the sprawling institution into an unusual, politicized sanctuary. During the German occupation, Saint-Alban sheltered political resistance fighters. More importantly, it successfully defied the Vichy regime's silent extermination policy, a brutal administrative mandate that deliberately starved tens of thousands of psychiatric patients to death across the country by classifying them as useless mouths. Tosquels fought this by organizing patients and medical staff to illegally barter on the black market and forage for supplies, directly linking political defiance with basic medical survival. Tosquels imparted a clinical insight that altered the young doctor's trajectory. He proposed a devastatingly simple concept. The asylum itself was sick. A psychiatrist could never genuinely heal a damaged human mind by locking it inside a rigid, authoritarian structure that mirrored the oppressive society that originally broke the patient. The old hospital repeated the colonial order. Doctors commanded, guards enforced, patients obeyed. Fanon wanted to break that structure. They immediately commenced dismantling the physical and psychological architecture of the institution. They unbolted and removed the heavy iron bars from the patient windows. They unlocked the ward doors, destroying the concept of strict confinement. Patients were granted the radical permission to wander the grounds freely without constant supervision. The entire facility was re-engineered into a collective therapeutic community. Within this new system, every single individual, from the chief physician down to the groundskeeper and the kitchen staff, played a crucial role in the daily healing process. He implemented his own anti-authoritarian methods within the wards. He entirely abandoned the standard medical practice of writing clinical notes during patient therapy sessions. Sitting safely behind a desk and silently scribbling while a vulnerable person confessed their trauma struck him as an act of colonial surveillance. It represented a sterile, deeply unequal form of data extraction. He dismantled that specific barrier, forcing a direct horizontal human interaction without the intimidating presence of official documentation. This profound institutional reform served as a critical laboratory. The isolated hospital functioned as a concentrated microcosm of the broader political reality outside its walls. By tearing down the iron bars and dismantling the internal hierarchy of Saint-Alban, he was conducting a vital rehearsal for a much larger operation. He clearly recognized a universal truth. If an authoritarian institutional structure manufactured severe psychological pathology, the only legitimate effective medical treatment was to completely obliterate and rebuild that exact structure from the ground up. The specific reform techniques he perfected within these medical walls fully prepared him to eventually operate on a vastly larger, heavily traumatized target. The theoretical concepts he had forged in France now demanded a much heavier testing ground. In December 1953, he crossed the Mediterranean to take a new post at the Blida Joinville Hospital in Algeria. The massive facility functioned as a sprawling containment zone, holding over 1,500 patients in squalor. The reigning medical establishment operated strictly under the infamous Algiers school doctrine. This racist clinical model dictated that the indigenous population was naturally hysterical, driven entirely by primitive instincts and completely incapable of rational thought. The architecture itself separated Muslim men from European women, fully enforcing the exact same segregation established by the colonial government outside. He initially attempted to implement the exact same progressive reforms he had just mastered in the mainland. He organized occupational therapy, film clubs, and social activities. It worked perfectly for the European patients, but it completely failed with the Muslim men. A standard colonial doctor would have immediately blamed the patients and blindly validated the deeply ingrained racist doctrines without hesitation. He diagnosed his own critical error instead. He realized he was forcing a Western psychological framework onto a colonized people, arrogantly demanding they assimilate to the culture of their oppressors simply to be cured. He abandoned the European blueprint and revolutionized the entire clinical approach. He ordered the direct construction of a traditional Moorish café directly on the hospital grounds. He brought in local storytellers to restore their oral traditions. He officially invited religious clerics to break the Ramadan fast alongside the men. He spent long nights in the remote mountains, studying indigenous Cabal healing methods. He replaced the sterile, imposed clinical authority with authentic, culturally responsive care. The results were immediate. The profound lethargy finally lifted. The men responded precisely because their reality was finally being acknowledged rather than erased. The hospital was functioning as an actual sanctuary for the oppressed indigenous population. Then, the reality outside the hospital walls completely fractured. In November 1954, coordinated strikes marked the abrupt beginning of a massive armed conflict across the territory. The delicate clinical sanctuary he had just painstakingly built was instantly pulled into the crossfire. The hospital wards rapidly filled with a terrifying, unprecedented new reality. Under the cover of darkness, severely wounded resistance fighters were secretly smuggled through the side doors. Vital medical bandages and powerful antibiotics began moving constantly through unauthorized channels. At the exact same time, French security personnel walked through the front doors. These officers arrived hollow-eyed and desperate for heavy sedatives, traumatized by the harsh interrogations they were conducting in the city centers. Inside the same hospital, Fanon treated both sides of the colonial wound. In one room, the wounded. In another, the men who had helped create the wound. The strict professional line separating the officially neutral medical healer and the politically active participant dissolved entirely. Without ever making an official public declaration of his allegiance, the isolated psychiatric facility quietly transformed into the primary clandestine medical headquarters for an underground revolution that was rapidly setting the entire colonial territory on fire, permanently altering his trajectory. The secret operations within the psychiatric ward could not remain insulated from the escalating conflict outside. By the autumn of 1956, the already fragile illusion of clinical neutrality completely collapsed. The French military apparatus had aggressively implemented harsh interrogations across the entire North African territory. His quiet consulting room rapidly became the most terrifying intersection of this systemic violence. He sat behind his desk and treated the shattered indigenous victims of these extreme interrogations. Hours later, he would treat the exact security officers who originally inflicted the trauma. These officers frequently arrived hollow-eyed and begging for heavy sedatives, suffering from acute insomnia triggered by the brutal methods they were ordered to execute. Listening to the deep trauma of the subjugated alongside the frantic confessions of the enforcers, the absurdity of his position became undeniable. Medicine fundamentally exists to repair the broken human body and integrate the individual back into their environment. But he faced an impossible ethical paradox. How could a physician justify repairing a broken individual, only to release them back into a highly engineered political machine specifically designed to crush them again? He definitively concluded that maintaining professional neutrality in the direct face of systemic oppression was not a moral high ground. It was active complicity. In late December, as the capital erupted into violent street riots, he officially crossed the point of no return. He moved covertly through the chaotic alleys to attend a clandestine meeting, formally pledging his allegiance to the highest commanders of the Liberation Front. Hours after securing this alliance, he sat down and drafted a historic resignation letter directed to the French Governor-General. He did not respectfully request administrative reforms or better funding. He delivered a cold, surgical indictment of the entire empire. He explicitly stated that the colonial reality was a massive tissue of lies, cowardice, and pure contempt for human dignity. He declared that when a governing system relies on the complete depersonalization of an entire population, medical tenacity ceases to be a professional virtue. It permanently transforms into morbid perseverance. The colonial administration reacted with immediate force. They drafted an official expulsion order, legally banishing him from the territory. The anticipated state retaliation struck the facility shortly after his departure. Armed security forces raided the medical wards. They dragged his former colleagues from their posts and threw them directly into military internment camps. One specific Muslim intern died after interrogation by the authorities, his life extinguished, and his name permanently erased from any official government record. He did not wait for the security forces to secure the handcuffs. Utilizing a highly coordinated underground network, he slipped across the Mediterranean. He moved swiftly through Europe, evading intelligence surveillance and hostile paramilitaries, before finally securing passage to Tunis. Stepping onto the foreign tarmac in the sweltering heat, he was immediately received by the exiled leadership of the revolution. He had permanently discarded the safety of the white medical coat. The diagnosing physician was officially gone. The uncompromising militant had arrived, prepared to dismantle the very empire that had trained him. The decision to sever ties with the colonial administration thrust him directly into the tense center of the Algerian exile in Tunis. The city operated as a diplomatic sanctuary, entirely saturated with foreign intelligence agents and armed refugees waiting for the front lines to shift. He assumed the remarkably thin disguise of Dr. Ibrahim Finesse, complete with a dedicated bodyguard, a fabricated identity that virtually every journalist saw through within a week. Yet, he did not abandon his clinical obligations. At the Charles Nicolle Hospital, he successfully established the very first psychiatric day clinic on the African continent. It was a highly revolutionary facility, where traumatized combatants suffering from the profound mental disorders of colonial warfare received critical treatment during daylight hours and returned to their families at night, completely devoid of traditional locked wards. Alongside his daily clinical rounds, he wielded a significantly different weapon. He became the sharpest editorial voice of El Mujahid, the underground French-language newspaper of the National Liberation Front. Operating inside a tense, smoke-filled office where he angrily unbuckled his wristwatch to signal his lack of patience, his unsigned articles were merciless. But a revolution is never a flawless, romantic endeavor. It demands devastating, permanent moral compromises. The Liberation Front frequently devoured its own people in the shadows. When the military wing eliminated over 300 rival villagers at Malousa, he sat before reporters and officially blamed French machinations. When Abene Ramdane, the brilliant political architect of the movement, was quietly eliminated by his own military comrades in an internal power struggle in Morocco, the official propaganda apparatus required a massive, coordinated lie. Fanon defended the fabricated story that Ramdane had fallen heroically on the battlefield. He coldly concluded that in a war for survival, objective truth was simply whatever inflicted the maximum damage upon the oppressor. He kept Ramdane's empty black wallet tucked inside his desk drawer, a permanent heavy reminder of the inescapable cost of political liberation. His visible propaganda role rapidly elevated him to a primary military target. Covert colonialist intervention squads, specifically the ruthless operative group known as the Red Hand, relentlessly hunted him across international borders. His vehicle was deliberately forced off a remote road, severely crushing his vertebrae and leaving him temporarily paralyzed. When he was flown out to a hospital in Rome for specialized spinal treatment, an explosive device intended for his arrival detonated prematurely at the airport, claiming the life of a civilian child. Italian authorities discreetly moved him from his assigned hospital bed mere hours before an armed operative burst through the door of the empty ward to execute the final intervention. Under constant threat of political elimination, he engaged a secretary and dictated his next major text. Pacing the floor in a rigid medical brace, he produced A Dying Colonialism, a forensic analysis detailing exactly how the extreme pressure of the armed conflict was re-engineering every single aspect of society, fundamentally altering everything from hidden radio sets to the strategic wearing of traditional veils. He was writing the arguments the revolution needed. The ideas he sharpened in Tunis soon demanded a significantly broader trajectory. In 1960, the High Command officially appointed him as an ambassador at large, deliberately stationing him in Guyana. His explicit directive was to aggressively push the heavily concentrated Algerian resistance movement directly southward into sub-Saharan territory. For Fanon, the geographic boundaries were entirely artificial. He rigorously argued that a genuine Algerian militant must physically feel the violent suppression occurring in Angola, or the severe oppression in the Rhodesias, directly inside their own chest. The fight was continental. Operating from a deeply Spartan, almost monastic apartment in Accra, he immersed himself in the center of the Pan-African awakening. He actively engaged with the emerging architects of a newly independent continent, eventually forging an important relationship with a young Congolese leader named Patrice Lumumba. When Lumumba assumed the prime ministership of the newly independent Republic of Congo, the resulting geopolitical crisis was immediate and absolute. The mineral-rich province of Katanga violently seceded, heavily backed by Western mining conglomerates and armed European mercenaries. The Congolese army mutinied, and Western intelligence agencies, deeply terrified of losing strategic control over vast resources, systematically engineered Lumumba's rapid political destruction. Witnessing the orchestrated collapse of a sovereign state, Fanon immediately flew into the destabilized capital of Leopoldville. According to accounts of this period, Fanon traveled into the crisis and urged Lumumba to preserve himself for a longer struggle. He found his ally severely isolated, directly besieged by protests funded by foreign intelligence. During a tense overnight meeting, he delivered a brutally pragmatic assessment. He pressed Lumumba to temporarily step aside from official power, to strategically reorganize his vulnerable forces, and to secure his physical survival for a future engagement. He coldly advised Lumumba's press attaché to abandon the prime minister and temporarily align with the opposing faction simply to maintain a tactical foothold. The desperate advice failed. Western intervention ruthlessly proceeded. A coordinated, internationally backed coup overthrew the government. Lumumba was subsequently captured, subjected to extreme abuse, and his remains were destroyed. This specific geopolitical targeting severely damaged his internal resolve. He openly confessed that the orchestrated destruction of Lumumba remained a deep, permanent wound he could never reconcile. It provided the clearest proof of his own theoretical warnings. The incident demonstrated with terrifying clarity that the global power structure would relentlessly deploy systemic violence to eliminate any colonial leader who genuinely refused to accept a compromised, deeply controlled independence. He witnessed firsthand how the machinery of empire effortlessly transitioned from direct occupation to covert targeting, effectively strangling a continent precisely at the moment it attempted to stand. But the wound of Congo did not slow him down. It pushed him harder. While attempting to open a new trans-Saharan supply route for the Liberation Army, the exhaustion in his body finally became impossible to ignore. Late in 1960, the crushing exhaustion settling deep into his bones finally yielded a highly lethal diagnosis. Doctors in Accra tested his blood and found the white cell count entirely abnormal. It was acute myeloid leukemia. In that medical era, doctors gave him very little time. He completely absorbed the terminal prognosis without a trace of sentimentality. Standing on a street corner, holding the folded laboratory results, he delivered the news to his colleagues with clinical detachment. He explicitly refused to surrender to the biological breakdown, coldly declaring that he would defend himself with his cortex. The frantic race against his own failing body commenced immediately. The military leadership desperately sought medical salvation across the globe. A Parisian hospital naturally meant immediate imprisonment or worse. He categorically dismissed the United States as a country marked by racial terror. They eventually secured emergency transit to the Soviet Union. Medical specialists in Moscow administered experimental chemotherapy, temporarily halting the aggressive cellular assault. The brief remission granted him a fragile, heavily borrowed window of time. He returned to Tunis knowing precisely how little sand remained in the glass. The military commanders had strictly forbidden him from dying in a frontline skirmish, explicitly declaring his revolutionary intellect too valuable an asset to lose to a random military patrol. Denied a literal weapon, his small, portable typewriter officially became his rifle. He initiated an uninterrupted 10-week intellectual marathon to forge his final, most devastating ideological strike. The production of his last manuscript was an act of extreme, uncompromising physical sacrifice. He relentlessly paced his austere apartment floor, verbally dictating the heavy theoretical text to his wife Josie, and dedicated secretaries for 8 to 10 grueling hours every single day. The leukemia frequently caused painful bleeding episodes behind his eyes, forcing him to dictate highly complex political philosophy while lying completely flat on his back in the dark. He refused any pain medication, aspirin, or rest, utterly terrified that chemical sedatives might accidentally blunt the sharp edges of his political analysis. He was spending the last of his strength to construct a permanent theoretical framework for global decolonization. Seeking maximum ideological impact for the impending publication, he traveled to Italy for a critical summit with the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Over 3 intense consecutive days inside a Rome apartment, the conversations ran deep into the morning hours, completely exhausting his prominent European allies. He outlined the impending catastrophic violence across the African continent with terrifying, mathematical precision. He did not seek any emotional comfort from the intellectual elite. He demanded active complicity. He pressed Sartre, fiercely demanding to know how a prominent philosopher could simply continue living a comfortable, undisturbed life while younger militants were walking into the machinery of repression for the cause. He was forcing them to carry part of the burden. His broken body was now rapidly shutting down, but his mind had successfully finished forging the exact manual required to dismantle the colonial world. The book he produced during those 10 agonizing weeks of dictation carried a title designed as a direct, unapologetic summons: The Wretched of the Earth. He bypassed polite academic introductions entirely. The opening pages delivered a blunt, uncompromising declaration to the world. Decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. It is never a peaceful negotiation. It is the systemic substitution of one species of men by another, because the colonial system it seeks to destroy was initially constructed, actively maintained, and rigorously enforced through extreme force. He mapped out the anatomy of this structural violence through a stark, completely binary landscape. The colonial reality was a world cut strictly in two. On one side stood the settlers' sector, brightly lit, paved, its garbage cans overflowing with discarded food, inhabited exclusively by people whose feet were protected by strong shoes. Directly across the heavily guarded line sat the native town, a starved, kneeling, crouching place defined by mud, cramped bodies, and severe chronic hunger. The colonized subject constantly stared across this heavily fortified dividing line with a deeply lustful envy, their physical muscles permanently tensed. In their sleep, the oppressed experienced muscular dreams of running, jumping, and fighting, temporarily liberating themselves from the physical paralysis enforced during their waking hours. Traditional European political theory consistently argued that organized urban workers would lead any successful uprising. He ruthlessly tore this doctrine apart. The urban working class within the colonies was far too deeply compromised. They possessed secure jobs, basic wages, and a vested interest in maintaining the existing economic structure. The actual revolutionary engine, the raw kinetic force required to shatter the system, lived exclusively within the starving rural peasantry and the sprawling urban underclass. The completely displaced populations and deeply alienated individuals in the neglected slums possessed absolutely nothing left to lose and lacked any logical reason to preserve the current status quo. He then delivered his most chilling, devastatingly accurate prophecy regarding the post-colonial future. He explicitly warned against the incoming national bourgeoisie. Once the occupying empire officially withdrew its military forces, these corrupt local elites would step directly into the exact same shoes left behind by the departed colonizers. They would not transform the extractive economy, they would simply inherit it. The newly independent nation would rapidly degenerate into a cheap commercial outpost operated strictly for foreign investors. The once heroic Liberation Party would inevitably hollow out into an empty, bureaucratic shell, while the national military quietly transitioned into the tyrannical rulers of the civilian population. He deliberately refused to conclude this militant manifesto with a triumphant, romanticized victory march. The final chapter abruptly shifted the focus directly back into the psychiatric ward. He laid out a devastating series of actual clinical case files, meticulously documenting the severe mental wreckage inflicted by the armed conflict. He detailed the acute paranoia of a severely tortured peasant, alongside the deep suicidal depression of an insurgent bomber relentlessly haunted by his own explosive acts. He systematically proved that structural violence leaves a permanent, highly toxic residue on the human nervous system, ultimately destroying the minds of both the oppressed and the oppressor forever. The physical toll of documenting that systemic wreckage finally broke the remaining defenses of his own failing body. By the autumn of 1961, just as the heavy manuscript was being transported to the printing presses, his body collapsed. He required immediate, highly specialized intervention. Returning to France was entirely impossible. He was a designated enemy of the state, hunted by ruthless paramilitaries across the continent. The liberation leadership evaluated the rapidly shrinking map and arrived at a bitterly ironic conclusion. The only remaining medical facility possessing the advanced hematology required to treat his specific leukemia was located directly inside the exact same superpower he had consistently condemned. He was forced to seek ultimate salvation inside the United States. Operating in a tense diplomatic gray zone, intelligence operatives covertly transported the dying revolutionary across the Atlantic. He was officially admitted into the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, utilizing a fabricated diplomatic passport bearing the alias Ibrahim Omar Fanon. The clinical interventions deployed to extend his survival were severely punishing. The medical staff aggressively initiated massive, continuous blood transfusions, desperately attempting to shock his completely depleted bone marrow back into basic functioning. During the long, sterile nights inside the American ward, these extreme medical procedures triggered deeply disturbing, heavily symbolic hallucinations. The psychiatrist who had meticulously dissected the intense psychological trauma of colonial assimilation experienced terrifying, recurring dreams. He visualized himself being physically forced inside an industrial washing machine, actively operated by the attending medical staff who were attempting to violently scrub the blackness directly from his skin. The underlying trauma of the colonial condition pursued him directly into his deathbed. Even as his respiratory system rapidly deteriorated, his analytical sharpness remained completely intact. When a local American activist visited his isolated ward, earnestly offering to protect the foreign patient from the harsh racial realities of the surrounding environment, he rejected the assistance with cold politeness. He explicitly stated he was perfectly capable of navigating systemic hostility himself, refusing to adopt the role of a helpless victim. The timeline rapidly accelerated toward its inevitable conclusion. On the 3rd of December, an Allied friend smuggled a fresh advance copy of the newly printed manifesto directly into the hospital room. His wife, Josie, sat quietly at the edge of the mattress and read aloud the very first published reviews praising the text. He absorbed the validation, held the physical book in his hands, and coldly noted that the ideological victory would not give him back his bone marrow. 3 days later, on the 6th of December, double bronchial pneumonia overwhelmed his severely weakened lungs. His heart stopped permanently at the age of 36. Fanon died in Bethesda, under a false name, far from the Algeria he had chosen as his political home. Soon after its release, French authorities moved to ban the book and seize available copies where they could from bookstores, officially declaring it an extreme threat to national security. The state censorship apparatus executed the sweep flawlessly, but they were already too late. The manual for revolution had already escaped. His body was flown back across the Atlantic and carried secretly into the liberated zones of Algeria. His old teacher, Aimé Césaire, would later write a powerful homage to him, definitively stating that his students' violence had always been the pure, uncompromising violence of justice. French police failed to contain the political diagnosis he had left behind. The confiscated book immediately crossed borders, successfully slipping into the rucksacks of global resistance movements. Che Guevara specifically commissioned a Spanish translation for Latin American guerrillas. The African National Congress and Steve Biko deeply utilized his psychiatric writings to build the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, recognizing that mental liberation must precede physical freedom. In the United States, the Black Panther Party adopted the text as their absolute cornerstone. They directly applied his clinical theories, opening free health clinics in impoverished neighborhoods, correctly realizing that medicine in the wrong hands was merely an instrument of social control, and true healing required dismantling the oppressive system itself. But the afterlife of his ideas was not only triumphant. Inside the revolutions he had served, Fanon's warnings began to come true. His ideological victory carried a deeply tragic, bitter aftermath. The warning he wrote in his final months began to come true with terrifying accuracy. The national bourgeoisie he warned about successfully seized power across the post-colonial landscape. This thin, parasitic elite smoothly replaced the departed European administrators, inheriting the entire colonial economy without altering its exploitative architecture. They transformed their newly independent nations into highly profitable enterprises for foreign investors, while their liberation parties hollowed out into empty authoritarian regimes. The sickening mimicry he previously diagnosed entirely consumed the newly formed states. Josie Fanon remained in Algiers, fiercely guarding his legacy as she watched this exact betrayal unfold. In 1988, she watched the new National Army turn against young Algerian protesters. The absolute, suffocating despair of seeing the revolution devour its own children broke her completely. In 1989, Josie Fanon died after years of carrying the grief and disillusionment of that failed promise. The oppressive system he violently fought had ultimately crushed the fragile future he envisioned for them all. Fanon's warning did not end in 1961. The borders changed. The method did not. Today, Congo remains one of the clearest examples of how resource extraction can continue under new names. It produces a major share of the world's cobalt, a mineral essential to modern batteries and technology. Rubber became uranium. Uranium became cobalt. The object changed, but the extraction remained. the physical chains were simply replaced by invisible, highly complex economic supply lines. The global power structure merely rotated its actors, while strictly maintaining the same extraction script. He correctly diagnosed an illness that continues to systematically deform the human condition globally. His final plea for a new humanity still remains unanswered. The modern world has heard the warning. It still refuses to listen.